An orphan girl saved a trapped Apache warrior 5 days later. The entire tribe rode into town, not for revenge, but for her. What happened in those 5 days would decide the fate of a whole community. If you want more stories like this, hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next chapter. The sun beat down like an iron hammer on the cracked Arizona earth, stripping life from the horizon under its relentless glare. For 16-year-old Abby Carter, the heat was just another layer to the suffocating quiet that wrapped around her life. She was an orphan, a shadow drifting along the edges of Redemption Gulch, a town slowly dying of thirst. The silver vein that had given the town its name dried up years ago, leaving nothing but false front buildings and men whose dreams had turned to dust. Her so-called guardian, her mother's brother, was a man named Horace Barton. Barton ran the general store, a place stocked with stale crackers, overpriced canned peaches, and his own long-fermented resentment. He'd taken her in after the cholera outbreak of '79, claimed her parents, but never let her forget what a burden she was. Every meal felt like a debt, every glance a reminder she didn't belong. The only place she found any peace was out in the desert, not among the town's suspicious stares and whispered gossip, but in the vast, dangerous beauty of the open land. Out there, she wasn't Barton's problem. Out there, she was simply Abby, a quiet observer, a student of the wild. She knew which cactus held water, how to read the track of a jackrabbit, and where the vultures circled when death was near. That hard-earned knowledge is what led her to Coyote Creek on a blistering Tuesday afternoon. Most of the year, the creek was nothing more than a strip of dry, baked sand. But strange off-season rains had turned some stretches into hidden traps, mud pits disguised as solid ground. She'd been trailing a Gila monster, fascinated by its slow, awkward crawl, when a sound froze her in place. It wasn't the yip of a coyote or the scream of a hawk. It was a low, guttural grunt of effort, followed by the wet, sucking noise of mud claiming its prize. Peering through a tangle of brittle mesquite, Abby's heart slammed against her ribs. Barely 20 yards away, a man was fighting to free himself, buried up to the waist in thick, choking mud at the creek bed. He was Apache. Every instinct sharpened by years of fear planted in her by the townsfolk screamed for her to run. The Apaches were the constant nightmare of Redemption Gulch. Sheriff Cole Granger, a man whose ambition was as large as his cruelty, made sure that fear never died. He told stories of stolen cattle, of wild dangers waiting just beyond the treaty line. The townsfolk, hungry for someone to blame for their misery, swallowed every word. To them, an Apache was a threat, plain and simple. But Abby saw something different. She didn't see a savage, she saw a man. His face was a mask of bone-deep exhaustion, his dark eyes wide with something raw and ancient. She knew that look. It was the look of someone staring down the edge of being alone, helpless to do a thing about it. It was a fear she understood all too well. It was a fear she knew all too well. The man was strong, his bare arms and shoulders roped with lean muscle, a necklace of turquoise standing out sharply against skin slick with sweat. But the mire had the upper hand. Every attempt he made to free himself only drove him deeper. A rawhide rope braided from horsehair hung coiled at his side, but the nearest mesquite root was still out of reach. He strained and grunted, sinking another inch each time as the mud swallowed him with greedy intent. Abby watched him for a full minute, her mind caught in a tug-of-war. She could almost hear Horace Barton's voice in her head, spitting warnings about Redskins, see the cold, superior face of Sheriff Cole Granger flicker in her memory. "Let him die," whispered the part of her that wanted to be safe. "It's not your problem." But then the man's head dropped forward, his breathing hitching into short, uneven bursts. He was giving up, choosing to let the desert claim him. And Abby, who'd been fighting her own battle just to stay alive each day, couldn't stand by and watch. She drew in a steadying breath and stepped out from her hiding spot. His head snapped up, eyes flaring with mistrust and rejection. He saw a skinny girl in a faded calico dress, sun-bleached hair tied back with a scrap of twine. He didn't lower his guard. "Don't move," she said, her voice rough from lack of use. It was a foolish thing to say. He couldn't move even if he wanted to. She corrected herself. "Stop fighting it. You'll only sink faster." He stared at her in silence, a wall she couldn't read. She caught sight of a knife hilt jutting from the waistband of his buckskin pants. He had no reason to trust her. She had plenty of reason not to trust him. Abby's eyes swept the creek bed, her mind working with the quick, practical clarity that came from a life lived close to the land. The mesquite root was the key. His rope wouldn't reach, but there were other ways. Her gaze landed on a sun-bleached limb from a palo verde tree, thick and sturdy. "I'm going to help you," she said, more to convince herself than him. She pointed to the branch, then to him, then to the root, miming how she'd tie her hemp rope always carried at her waist to the branch and slide it toward him. He studied her, his face unreadable. Dragging the branch to the edge of the muck was a battle in itself. It was heavy, awkward, but she got it there and tied her rope tight around one end. Now came the dangerous part, getting close enough to reach him without sharing his fate. She lay flat, spreading her weight, and carefully pushed the branch toward the quagmire. It fell short. Their eyes met, and for the first time she didn't see suspicion, but a desperate understanding. He nodded toward his own lariat, then to the tip of the branch he wanted her to make a chain. It was risky. He could use the rope to pull her in. A shiver traced her spine. But when she looked into his eyes, saw the exhaustion carved deep there, she made her choice. She'd trust him. With effort, he uncoiled his lariat and tossed it toward her. It landed short. He tried again, and again. Sweat streamed down his face muscles, trembling from the strain. On the fourth throw, the loop just reached the branch's tip. Carefully, Abby hooked it and secured it tight. Now there was a link between them. She crawled backward to firm ground, heart hammering, then tied her end of the hemp rope to the thickest part of the mesquite root, pulling it taut. "Pull slow. Use the branch for leverage," she called out. He understood. Bracing against the branch, he began inching upward, matching his movements to the rhythm of his breath. Abby held the rope with all her strength, body locked against the root, her knuckles white. The mud made a sickening sound with each gain. Time dragged like an eternity. The sun blazed overhead, insects droned in the thick air. The only sounds were his labored breathing and the reluctant slurp of the mire letting go. Nearly an hour passed before, with one final desperate surge, he wrenched his hips free. He crawled forward like a wounded animal through the shallows until he collapsed on the dry, cracked bank, coated head to toe in gray muck and shaking uncontrollably. Abby didn't move toward him. She stayed by the root, her own body trembling from the rush of adrenaline and the raw relief. For a long while he lay there, chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven breaths. ChatGPT Danai. When he finally managed to push himself upright, every ounce of effort showing in the movement, he looked at her. The hostility that had been etched into his face was gone, replaced by a crushing weariness, and something else, a glimmer that looked a lot like respect. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, the words coming first in his native Apache tongue, which she couldn't understand. But the tone, that she recognized without question, it was gratitude pure and unshakable, the kind that almost didn't seem real. Then he switched to halting English, his accent thick. "You save me." Abby gave the smallest of nods, suddenly feeling shy and overwhelmed by the moment. "You were trapped," she murmured. He glanced toward the horizon where the sun was bleeding out its last light, then back to her. Both of them knew without speaking if she hadn't shown up, he'd have been gone before morning, claimed by the desert-cold thirst or some hungry predator. The truth was simple. He owed her his life. He rose unsteadily, his whole frame coated in dried mud that was already cracking against his skin. He needed water. He needed rest. And he was miles from his own people, stranded in country where every shadow could be a threat. "I'm Coda," he said, touching his chest. "Abby," she answered softly. He seemed to take the name and tuck it away like something valuable. His eyes swept the vast, darkening land around them. He was exposed. Abby saw it too, and the same instinct that had driven her to risk herself for him flared again. She couldn't just leave him here. The sheriff and his deputies sometimes rode this far out. If they stumbled on him alone and weakened, they'd either kill him outright or drag him back to town as a warning. She thought of a small cave she'd discovered the year before, a crack in the rock about 1/3 of a mile away, hidden behind a screen of desert willows. Dry. Safe. "Come on," she said, making a choice that would change the course of her life. "I know a place. You can rest there. You'll be safe." Coda studied this pale-skinned stranger who had come out of nowhere and hauled him from what might as well have been a grave. He found no deceit in her blue eyes, only a strength that mirrored the unforgiving land she called home. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. Once again, in the same day, he was placing his life in her hands. As the sunset bled into purple and gold along the rim of the canyon, the orphan girl and the Apache warrior slipped into the deepening shadows, leaving the hungry mud of Coyote Creek behind them. The cave was just as Abby remembered it, a cool breath of darkness in contrast to the heat still clinging to the air. Small, no bigger than the pantry in Barton's store, with a floor of smooth stone and a complete veil from the outside world. She guided Coda inside. His body still shook from exhaustion and the chill left behind by the drying mud. That first day they spoke almost nothing. Language separated them, but survival bound them together. Abby knew the first thing he needed was water. She left him sheltered in the cave and made for a hidden spring she knew, carrying the dented canteen she'd borrowed from the store months ago. When she returned, she found Coda scraping at the hardened mud on his skin with a flat rock. His movements were slow, pained. She handed him the canteen. He drank greedily, eyes closing in relief as if the water put strength back into him with every swallow. He glanced down at his clothes and skin, both caked in filth with clear distaste. Abby understood and pointed toward a shallow pool downstream from the spring. He nodded, and with a quiet dignity, left to wash. While he was gone, she turned her attention to gathering food. Years alone in the desert had made her a living map of what it could offer. She found a handful of sweet mesquite beans, dug out starchy yucca roots, and came across a small clutch of quail eggs. It wasn't much, but it would be enough. When Coda returned cleaner, though still pale with fatigue, she had a fire going in the cave's deepest corner. It was a smokeless fire built from dry wood, so no scent would drift outside. She roasted the yucca root in the embers. They ate without speaking, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the soft whisper of the wind outside. Coda's eyes stayed on her, steady and searching, as though he were trying to piece her together. Why had she helped him? What kind of girl lived this far from white settlements, so at ease in a land that gave nothing for free? Meanwhile, back in Redemption Gulch, a different kind of fire was starting to catch. Sheriff Granger stood on the saloon's porch, a tall, imposing figure with a tarnished silver star pinned to the front of his dust-blackened vest. His ice-colored eyes swept over the crowd gathered in the street, each face drawn tight with unease. "It's been 2 days now," said a heavy-set man named Peterson the blacksmith. "Frank Miller, don't just vanish like that. He rode out toward Coyote Creek looking for gold and never came back. Frank Miller was known as a drunk and a fool, but at least he was a drunk and a fool who was always around." Granger let the tension in the air build, keeping his expression solemn. "I found tracks," he said, finally, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. "A horse without shoes headed east, toward Apache land." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. It was exactly the spark Granger had been waiting for. For months, he'd been exchanging quiet letters with a man named Corrigan, who owned a large cattle and land company out of Arizona. Corrigan had offered him a handsome sum, enough to make him the unchallenged power in this dying town if he could clear out the treaty lands nearby. Company geologists were convinced that beneath those Apache grazing grounds lay a rich copper deposit worth far more than the played-out silver that had once kept Redemption Gulch alive. but they needed a reason, something to justify breaking the treaty and seizing control. A murdered prospector fit the bill perfectly. In truth, Miller had a habit of disappearing on long drinking sprees. Granger had simply paid him to stay gone longer, this time holed up in a town more than 100 miles away. "They're getting bold," Granger went on, his voice sharpening. "Crossing the treaty line, testing us. And now a man's gone missing. What are we gonna do? Let 'em pick us off one by one." His bellow was met with a roar from the townsfolk, fear and desperation twisting together. Horace Barton stood on the edge of the group, his face puckered in a permanent scowl. He hadn't seen Abby since yesterday morning. The girl was always slipping off somewhere, a constant thorn in his side. When she came back, she was due for a real tongue-lashing. For now, he kept listening to the sheriff nodding along. The Apaches made for a perfect scapegoat for everything that had gone wrong in his life. Back in the cave, the second day had passed, and Koda's strength was returning. Color had begun to creep back into his face, and his movements carried more steadiness. He started pointing at objects, telling her their names in Apache to, for water she, for plant se, for stone. Abby picked them up quickly, repeating each word before telling him the English for it. It became their quiet game, a thin but growing thread of understanding in the cool dark of the cave. At last he asked the question that had been in his eyes from the start. "Why you help me?" Abby stared into the small fire between them. How could she explain the suffocating weight of her loneliness, the way she'd always felt out of place in her own town? How the raw, unvarnished truth of the desert felt more like home than the polite lies and painted smiles of the people there. "You'd have died," she said simply. "Nobody deserves to die alone." That seemed to be enough for him. He nodded slowly. Later that same day, he showed her his knife. It was a beautiful piece, the handle inlaid with silver and turquoise, the design a braid of lines that spoke of age and meaning. Through broken words and gestures, he explained it was a symbol of the bond between Nada, Mother Earth, and Yusin, Father Sky. He tried to make her understand he wasn't a warrior. He was training as a medicine man, a singer of sacred prayers. He had been traveling alone on a spiritual walk, seeking a rare mountain plant used in healing ceremonies. He'd been following the flight of an eagle when he'd stumbled into the creek and the treacherous mud. That revelation shifted everything in how Abby saw him. He wasn't just a man, he was a spiritual guide, a keeper of his people's traditions. His life carried a worth that reached far beyond himself. That night, the fever took hold of him. A deep, wrenching cough racked his body, the result of swallowing foul water from the quicksand. His breathing turned weak and shallow. Fear rooted Abby in place. She couldn't take him into the bright-lit main street of town. They'd string him up before any doctor could lay eyes on him. So she turned to what she did know. She remembered her mother during the cholera outbreak brewing tea from willow bark to bring down a fever. The memory was hazy, steeped in grief, but it was all she had. Leaving Koda delirious in the cave, she slipped out into the moonlight and found a small stand of desert willows, stripping the bark with care. When she returned, she boiled it in her small tin pot, the same one she used for cooking, and coaxed him to drink. All through the night, she kept a damp cloth to his forehead, urging more of the bitter tea past his lips. She didn't close her eyes once, watching the rise and fall of his chest, while the small fire beside them was her only company in the black silence. She was terrified if he died here with her, his blood would stain her hands. Her people would call her a murderer, his people a traitor. But with the first light of dawn, the tremors eased. The fever broke. He fell into a deep, natural sleep. Exhausted. Abby leaned her head against the cold cave wall and finally drifted off. Hours later, a hand on her shoulder startled her awake, heart pounding. It was Koda. He was sitting up, eyes clear, the fever gone. He glanced at the pot with the dregs of willow bark tea, then back at her. "You are a healer," he said, his voice carrying a quiet, weighty respect. His hand lifted to the turquoise necklace around his neck, dozens of small, perfectly polished stones strung with silver beads. It was the most beautiful thing Abby had ever seen. With deliberate care, he raised it over his head. She shook hers quickly, understanding what he meant to do. "I don't want anything," she told him. "This is not payment." Coda replied, his English stronger than she'd heard before. "It is a bond. You are tied to me now. You saved my life. I carry your act. My people carry your act. This is so they will know you. So you will be safe." He set the necklace in her hands. It was cool and heavy, a true piece of his world. She looked at the stones, then into his steady face. To refuse would be a deeper insult than to accept. Slowly, she slipped it over her head. The turquoise felt strange and cool against her skin beneath her dress. He smiled, then a warm, genuine smile that softened his whole face. "Coda Deswood," he said, touching his chest, his full name. "Abby Carter," she answered. Something deep shifted between them in that moment. They were no longer just a white girl and an Apache man. They were Coda and Abby, bound by an act of compassion that had saved a life in a land scarred by hatred. But outside their shelter, the storm Sheriff Granger had set in motion was building, and it was coming straight for them. On the morning of the fourth day, Coda knew he had to leave. His strength was back, the fever only a shadow, and the weight of duty to his people pressed on him. The ceremony he'd been preparing for could not happen without him. "I must go," he told Abby, his gaze fixed on the strip of clear sky framed in the cave's entrance. "My people will worry. They will think the worst." Abby's heart tightened. These last days in the cave had become a strange kind of home for her, a world far removed from Barton's contempt and the stifling shadow of Redemption Gulch. Here with Coda, she wasn't a burden, she was someone who mattered, an equal. The thought of returning to her old life hurt in a way that felt almost physical. "It's dangerous," she said, not needing to explain further. "The sheriff's stirring up trouble," Abby said quietly. "He's telling folks a prospector's been kidnapped." Coda's jaw tightened. He'd already heard whispers about this sheriff, this Bilagana with the iron heart, as some of his people called him. They spoke of him by the shine of his badge and the cold in his chest. "He's looking for an excuse to spill blood," Coda said in a low, steady voice. "He wants the land we stand on. That missing man, it's a lie. They'll come for me, or for mine. Then I'll become a shadow," he added, rising to his feet. He gathered the few things he had, his knife and empty canteen, his now clean lariat. Turning toward her, his expression softened. "I won't forget this, Abby Carter. My family won't forget. My clan won't forget." She wanted to believe him, but his world felt a million miles from hers. "I'll take you to the Three Sisters," she offered, meaning the tall rock formation. "From there you can follow the dry wash all the way to your lands. It's hidden far from the main trail." He nodded, gratitude in his eyes. They left the cave, erasing every trace of their stay, and set out under the high morning sun. For a time they walked in silence, two small figures against a vast, unyielding land. But this was no longer the same silence. It was the quiet of a farewell. When they reached the towering sandstone pillars known as the Three Sisters, they stopped. The lands of the Apache Nation stretched out ahead, a hazy blue line on the horizon. "Here," Abby said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay in the wash, you'll be safe there." She turned to face him, and he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You have a strong heart, stronger than these stones. Don't let your people's fear make it small." His gaze dropped to her simple calico dress. "Hide the necklace. Don't let them see it. It's for you, not for their eyes." Abby nodded, tucking the heavy turquoise beads beneath her collar. It felt like hiding a part of herself. "Take care, Abby," he said. "You too," she replied. With one last look that lingered before fading, he turned and melted into the landscape, his movements sure and silent, leaving her alone with the wind and the stillness. The walk back to Redemption Gulch was the loneliest she had ever known. With each step, the choking weight of her reality settled back on her shoulders. As the town came into view, her stomach knotted, She'd barely taken 2 steps past the blacksmith's shop when her uncle's hand clamped around her arm like a steel trap. "Where the hell have you been, girl?" "Horace." Barton growled, his breath sour with old coffee and anger. "4 days you've been off while I've been worried sick." He wasn't worried, he was mad she'd disrupted his routine. "I was just exploring," she stammered. "Exploring? There's a savage loose, a man missing, and you're out gallivanting like it's a Sunday picnic." He yanked her toward the general store. "The sheriff's been asking questions. Folks are talking about the orphan girl who don't speak to nobody, who disappears into the desert like some wild animal. Makes me look bad." He dragged her through the store's front room into the small, stifling back room. His beady eyes bored into her face, searching for any sign of defiance. "You're a curse, that's what you are. Just like your father, head stuck in the clouds, no sense for anything practical." "That's not true." Abby snapped, heat in her voice. His expression darkened at her tone. "You dare talk back to me?" His gaze dropped to her collar, catching the faint bulge beneath the fabric. Before she could move, his hand shot out, yanking the turquoise necklace into view, its stones bright against her pale skin. Barton's jaw fell open. He knew craftsmanship like this. It was Apache work, and it was worth plenty. His eyes locked on hers, his face twisting into something ugly with suspicion. "Where'd you get this?" he hissed, venom in his voice. I found it," she lied, her heart pounding. "Liar," he spat. "You've been with him, haven't you? With that savage? You've been with an Apache." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. To him, there was only one reason an Apache man would give a white girl something like that one that made his blood boil with shame and rage. Before she could get a word out in her own defense, Sheriff Granger shoved through the back room door, his boots striking hard against the worn wooden floorboards. He'd seen Barton haul Abby inside and had a nose for trouble. "Family dispute." Horace Barton muttered, his finger trembling as he pointed at her. "Look at this," he said, holding the necklace up for the sheriff to see. "She's been off with one of them for 4 days. This is how she pays her keep keeping company with savages." Granger's cold eyes moved from the turquoise to Abby's terrified face. A slow, mean smile crept across his lips. This was better than anything he'd planned, more than just an excuse. This was a rallying cry. He began circling her like a coyote sizing up a calf. "The little orphan's got herself a secret friend," he said, snatching the necklace from Barton's hands. "Fine work. Gift from the man who killed Frank Miller. He didn't kill anyone." Abby's fear was swept aside by a flash of fierce protectiveness. "His name's Coda, and he was trapped. I saved his life." Granger barked a dry, humorless laugh. "You saved him? How convenient. I think you helped him. I think you gave him his way out. You're a traitor, girl, a traitor to your own." He turned back to Barton. "She knows where they're holed up. She can take us straight to them." Abby's blood turned to ice. "No, I won't." "Oh, I think you will," Granger said with calculated calm. But then a sharper idea crossed his mind. Taking her along would be messy. Leaving her behind after riling the whole town with the story of her betrayal, that would be far more useful. "Lock her up," Granger ordered. "Put her in the cellar. She doesn't come out until we're back. We've got a posse to raise." The cellar. Barton's face went pale. "Do it," Granger growled, his tone brooking no argument. "Or I start looking through your account books." That was all it took. The color drained completely from Barton's face. He grabbed Abby's arm harder this time, desperation in his grip, and dragged her despite her kicking and pleading toward the heavy wooden door that led down behind the store. "Uncle, please don't do this," she begged, tears breaking in her voice. "You're sending them to their deaths. They've done nothing wrong." He wouldn't meet her eyes. Shoving her into the damp, dark space, he slammed the door shut, sealing her in shadow. Outside, she heard the sheriff's boots stomp away, followed by his voice booming down the street. "Ring the bell. Town meeting. Arm yourselves, men. We ride at dawn. We've got the traitor, and she's shown us the way." Moments later, The slow, mournful toll of the town bell rolled through the air, heavy as a death knell. Down in the cold, wet cellar, Abby pounded her fists against the unyielding wood until they ached. The earth swallowed her cries. She had saved one man's life, and in doing so had doomed an entire people to face the wrath of Redemption Gulch. The posse was already gathering. The cellar's darkness felt alive, thick, suffocating. It reeked of damp soil, of rotting potatoes forgotten for months, and of that metallic tang that always walks hand in hand with despair. For hours, Abby sat imprisoned, not just behind a locked door, but trapped with every sound filtering down from the world above. The heavy thump of boots across the porch, the rowdy shouts of men drunk on whiskey and lies, the cold, ominous clicks of rifles being checked and loaded. Each sound was another nail in the coffin of the fragile peace she had tried to protect. The betrayal from her uncle cut deeper than any fear of the dark. It wasn't just that he'd locked her away, he'd made the deliberate choice to side with the sheriff's poisoned lies over the truth in his own kin's eyes. He had looked straight at her, seen the truth there, and still cast her aside, clinging to the pitiful image he kept in a town already rotting on its feet. That final abandonment from the only family she had left carved an icy hollow in her chest where fear had once lived. That emptiness filled quickly with something just as cold, but harder, a resolve that wouldn't break. She would not be the spark that lit a massacre. She would not let the people of that town snuff out her compassion. Tears were not an option. With effort, she pushed herself up from the packed dirt floor, her hands feeling blindly along the limits of her prison. Her fingers traced damp stone walls coated in a slick film until they found the rough grain of wood. It was an old, forgotten crate, half-rotted and ready to fall apart. She slid her fingers beneath a loose plank and yanked with desperation-born strength. The wood groaned in protest, a rusted nail tearing her palm and drawing blood she barely noticed. Splinters dug into her skin. At last, with a sharp crack, the plank came free. It wasn't much, just a thin scrap of weak wood against a solid oak door, but it was something. It was a chance. It was hope. She groped her way to the door, heart pounding hard enough to shake her ribs. She froze, listening. The sounds of the town had faded to a low, waiting murmur. They were biding their time until sunrise. She didn't have much of it left. Planting her feet, she threw her weight into the door. Old iron hinges groaned out a high metallic shriek that split the silence like a cry of pain. She held still, listening. Nothing. She pressed her shoulder to the wood, twisting and shoving again. Sweat ran down her forehead, mixing with grime. Every muscle burned. Somewhere inside the wood, a screw rusted by decades of damp loosened with a faint tick. A sharp, hot thread of hope shot through her chest. She kept going, hands bloodied, breath ragged, the world narrowing to the brutal task before her. The plank, the hinge, the stubborn door. Then, with a final cry that seemed to tear straight from her soul, the top hinge gave way. The heavy door sagged inward under its own weight, tearing loose from the bottom and leaving a dark gap just enough for her to squeeze through. She slipped out in a single bound, drinking in the cold, clean air of the storeroom like a lifeline. Freedom. Pale moonlight cut through the front windows, casting a ghostly glow over the floating dust. She crept to the glass and peered outside. The street was deserted, draped in long black shadows. Only one lamp burned on the saloon's porch, where 3 self-appointed guards sat slumped in their chairs, rifles across their laps, heads nodding in sleep. At the far end of town, the livery stable lay dark and still. That was her way out. Slipping out the store's back door, she became a moving shadow in her torn calico dress. The alleys and patches of darkness that had been her hiding places as a child were now her salvation. Her bare feet made no sound on the hard-packed dirt as she slid from shadow to shadow. Reaching the stable felt like a holy victory. The big door wasn't locked, only held by a wooden latch. The warm, familiar scent of hay and horses wrapped around her like a strange comfort in the middle of her fear. She knew these animals. There was old Belle, the blacksmith's mare, gentle but slow. There were 6 other ordinary mounts, nothing special. And then there was Diablo. He filled the largest stall a living shadow, a fire-eyed black that Sheriff Granger had won in a poker game. The horse was as fierce, powerful, and untamed as his owner. No one in Redemption Gulch dared ride him but the sheriff himself. Abby didn't have the luxury of caution. She didn't need steady, she needed lightning. She approached the stall slowly, one hand out, her voice low and steady. Diablo lifted his head sharply, eyes glinting in the half-light. He snorted a hot breath and struck the ground with a single hoof. He could sense her fear, but there was something else in her too, a quiet steadiness shaped by the hard edges of the wild, a language animals understood better than people. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her tone firm and calm, cutting through the dark like a taut wire. "We've got work to do. We've got to get out of here," she said, as her gaze found the sheriff's heavy saddle and bridle. Her hands trembled, but they moved with a clumsy, determined speed. The black refused at first, stepping back in distrust, but she didn't yield. Her touch stayed firm, her will unshaken. She led him out into the yard where the moon poured a dull silver light over the packed dirt. The silence stretched tight as a lariat. With a contained grunt, she swung into the saddle. For a moment she thought the big horse would throw her, but she didn't let go of the reins. Her small frame stayed anchored in the seat through sheer grit. She didn't turn toward the main road. Instead, she drove him straight into the open desert toward the black cuts of the canyons. The race had begun. By the first streak of dawn, Sheriff Granger was already in front of his men, a dark silhouette of forced authority. 30 pairs of eyes stared back at him, faces carved with a mix of false resolve and real anxiety. Horace Barton was among them, pale, sweating, clutching a heavy rifle like he expected it to bite him. "Today, we ride for justice for our friend, Frank Miller." Granger bellowed, his voice dripping with counterfeit nobility. "We ride to show the Apaches they can't cross our land, harm our people, and hide behind a treaty written on paper." The girl, the traitor, confirmed their hold-up in the canyons near the Three Sisters. "We'll smoke 'em out like rats," he roared, and the mob answered with a ragged cheer. Spurs bit into flanks and the horses lunged forward. They became a blind wave of vengeance, a creature made of dust and fury, thundering toward Apache country. Abby was fighting her own battle. She was pushing Diablo harder than she'd ever believed possible. The trail was a nightmare, an uneven, narrow spine of rock with a yawning drop on one side that sank into violet shadow. The black was surprisingly nimble, his hooves striking stone with force, sparks flashing from his shoes. Each step was a gamble. Loose rocks skittered away under his weight, their clatter falling for what felt like forever into the emptiness below. The wind tore at her, trying to rip her from the saddle. Overhead, the sun climbed mercilessly, burning without pity. Her throat was as dry and cracked as the land beneath her, her body an aching map of pain, but she didn't ease up. 2 images burned in her mind, Coda's calm, steady face, and Sheriff Granger's cruel, victorious sneer. Those visions drove her onward. She gripped Diablo's mane, tight knuckles white as bone, and kept riding. Finally, she burst out of the canyons just as the sun reached its peak, spilling over a mesa that commanded the vast plain below. Diablo was lathered with sweat, his sides heaving. Down in the distance, she saw them, the hunting party. From up here, they looked like 100 black insects crawling over the ochre desert still miles from the treaty line, a border marked by whitewashed stone pillars. She'd beaten them. A surge of relief so strong it nearly buckled her ran through her, but almost instantly that relief soured into a crushing sense of helplessness. She was just one girl on a stolen horse. What could she really do? That's when she saw it. Movement beyond the treaty line along the high ridge that commanded the whole plain. Something was there. At first it was nothing more than a shimmering blur, just another mirage twisting in the heat. Then the haze hardened into shapes. One rider on a small pony, then another. 10, 20, 50, 100. In mere minutes the entire ridgeline was filled. They were Apaches, sitting their ponies in a silence so deep and heavy it carried more weight than any war cry could. They didn't move, frozen against the burning blue of the sky. The sun flashed off the polished steel of a rifle barrel, here the sharp point of a lance there. The only motion was the slow ripple of an eagle feather tied into a warrior's long black hair. This wasn't an ambush, and it wasn't a band caught off guard. It was an entire nation that had arrived, and they had been waiting. The posse saw them at the same time. The rowdy talk and false bravado evaporated in an instant, swallowed by the vast, oppressive quiet. Horses came to a dead stop. Faces went slack, then hardened into the pale, stiff look of men who'd just felt the cold slide of fear up their spines. This wasn't about running a handful of savages out of a canyon. This was the edge of a war they couldn't possibly win. The men glanced at each other, and whatever courage they'd been faking melted away like snow on a hot griddle. "Hold the line!" Granger barked, his voice cracking toward a shrill edge. He yanked his pistol free, the silver glint catching the sun. His 6 hired guns followed suit, hardening their expressions, but the townsmen, the blacksmith, the storekeepers. Horace Barton hesitated, their rifles suddenly feeling like they weighed a ton. "It's an ambush!" one of Granger's men shouted, giving voice to the panic that had frozen them all. The girl led us into a trap. Granger's face twisted into a mask of seething rage. This wasn't part of the deal. He'd wanted a skirmish, something small, a few bodies scattered just enough to muddy the waters and give his land company backers the excuse they needed. But not this. Not this crushing, silent verdict. Still, he was in too deep now. Turning back would be an admission that the whole thing was a lie. His reputation, his future, his very identity in this town hung by a thread. "They're bluffing!" he bellowed, trying to grab hold of the control slipping through his fingers like water. "It's just for show. First rank, get ready to fire on my command." From the top of the ridge, a lone rider broke away from the main body and began descending slowly, deliberately. He carried no rifle. His hands hung open at his sides. A single eagle feather crowned his long, dark hair. As he drew closer, Abby felt her breath catch. It was Coda. He rode with unshakable dignity, back straight gaze steady, advancing toward the gathered men. He was no longer the exhausted man she had pulled from the mud. He was Coda Deswood, a leader, the living will of his people. He stopped his pony just beside the whitewashed treaty stones. Granger, spotting the perfect target for his scapegoat, raised his pistol and aimed straight for Coda's heart. "That's him! The killer! Fire!" he roared. But before any finger could tighten on a trigger, another sound tore through the suffocating tension, the frantic thunder of hooves coming in fast from the flank. Abby, unleashing a wordless cry, drove Diablo into one last desperate sprint, charging straight into the no-man's land between the two sides. With a fierce yank on the reins, Abby brought the black stallion to a dead stop, hooves screaming against the earth, foam flying, and planted herself squarely between Granger and his target. Her voice tore from her throat like a thunderclap of pure defiance. "You're not going to shoot!" Granger's eyes snapped to her, his face twisting into a grotesque mix of shock and fury. "Get out of the way, you damn traitor! She's no traitor!" Another voice rang out, clear, steady, and carrying across the plain with a weight that silenced everything else. It was Coda. His gaze swept past Granger, fixing on the frightened faces of the townsfolk. "She is Abby Carter, the one who saved my life." Sitting taller in the saddle, he continued, "I am Coda Deswood of the Cedar Hawk clan. 4 days ago, I was trapped in the mud of your creek. I would be dead now, my bones whitening under the sun, if not for this young woman. She didn't help an Apache. She helped a man. She showed me the sacred bond of kinship while your sheriff preaches only hate." She asked nothing in return. A ripple of unease moved through the posse. Men shifted their eyes from Abby's dust-streaked, unflinching face to Coda's dignified bearing, and finally to the silent ranks of Apache warriors watching from the ridge. Garrett's lies began to wobble under their weight. He's lying to save himself." Garrett barked desperation, fraying his voice. "He killed Frank Miller, and the girl, she's his whore." "Look at her." Digging into his vest pocket, he yanked out the turquoise necklace and held it high, its blue stones flashing against the dusty backdrop. "This is her payment for betrayal." Coda's eyes narrowed. That was no payment. It was a gift of honor, a sign she would be known as a friend to the Apache people and that she would be protected. As for the missing man, we've seen no one. We've harmed no one. Your sheriff seeks a war you will lose. He seeks it not for justice, but for greed. At that moment, from the back of the crowd, a young deputy named Miller, who had long harbored doubts about Garrett's cold ambition, found a courage he didn't know he had. Urging his horse forward, he spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "Sheriff, 3 weeks ago, you told me to send $100 from the town's account to a man in Prescott. You said it was for Frank Miller." The world seemed to freeze. A sharp collective gasp cut through the ranks. From the blacksmith to Horace Barton, every head turned toward Garrett. The lie he had spun so carefully shattered beyond repair. There had been no murder, no attack. Only the foul stench of the sheriff's ambition laid bare. Garrett's face drained to white, then flushed into a blotched, furious purple. He was finished exposed. His authority, his power, his entire standing in the town crumbled in an instant, punctuated by a raw, wordless roar of rage. Whipping his pistol around, he didn't aim at Coda, the man who had bested him, but at the root of his undoing, the defiant young woman who had started it all. He leveled the gun at Abby, but he never fired. From the silent line on the ridge came a single, almost imperceptible movement. An elder, his face carved with the deep lines of a lifetime, lifted a long rifle with a speed that defied his years. The shot cracked, not like a gunshot, but like rock splitting in the heat. Garrett's revolver flew from his hand as if struck by an unseen hammer. He let out a sharp cry, more from shock than pain, as he clutched the mangled mess of bone and flesh that had been his hand. Just like that, the fight was over. The lie collapsed in an instant. Two of Granger's own townsmen, not his paid guns but locals already looking for a way out, lunged forward, yanked him from the saddle and held him down. Coda rode forward, crossing the line of whitewashed treaty stones. He reined in his pony beside Abby and didn't spare so much as a glance for the chaos of Granger's capture or the downcast, shamed faces of the posse. His eyes stayed on her. The wind lifted a strand of hair across her face, but her gaze held steady. "A brave heart," Coda said quietly, his voice calm, a faint, warm smile brushing his lips, strong as the rocks. Abby met his eyes, then looked past him to the 100 silent riders on the ridge, then to the people of her town. They no longer looked at her with suspicion or mockery. Now their eyes held something else, a mixture of respect and awe that made them lower their heads. 5 days ago, she had been an invisible orphan belonging nowhere. Today, she had stopped a war. The Apache hadn't come for vengeance. They had come to witness the truth and honor the sacred bond she had forged, knee-deep in mud with one of their own. In the stillness that followed, justice came quickly. The townsfolk themselves bound Sheriff Granger and his hired men. The shame they felt burned cold and hard when they realized how easily they'd been manipulated. Horace Barton, unmasked and humiliated, couldn't bring himself to meet Abby's eyes. Redemption. Gulch had been forced to stare into the mirror of its own prejudice, and it didn't like what it saw. The Apache asked for no land, no payment, only that the treaty's sanctity be respected and the truth be told. Coda, along with the tribal council, once fractured, but now whole again, thanks to Abby, stood firm on that. As a final gesture, an elderly woman with eyes carrying generations of wisdom stepped forward and formally offered Abby a place among them, a home at the heart of the Apache nation, not as a guest, but as family. It was a tempting offer, a life free of the ghosts that haunted her past. But as she looked at the humbled faces of the townsfolk, she saw another path. With grace, she declined choosing to stay. Her work wasn't finished. Redemption Gulch, as its name suggested now, had a true chance at redemption. And Abby knew she was no longer an outsider. She was the seed from which a new, more honest community could grow. She had found her place not by running from her world, but by having the courage to change it for the better. You know, friends, the more I think about Abby's story, the more it hits me just how powerful one simple act of compassion can be. She had every reason to walk away that day in the desert. Fear, prejudice, even her own safety were screaming at her to leave Coda behind. But she didn't. She chose humanity over hate, and that choice didn't just save one life. It stopped an entire war before it began. This isn't just a tale about the Wild West. It's a reminder that the lines we draw between us and them are often built on lies and fear. Abby proved that courage isn't about pulling a trigger or riding the fastest horse. It's about standing up for what's right when it's hardest to do so. She didn't just change Coda's fate, she changed her town's future. And maybe that's the heart of it. The idea that kindness is not weakness, that one person's decency can echo far beyond what they ever imagined. So now I want to hear from you. What did this story mean to you? Did it change how you think about bravery or about compassion? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it.